The sound of my F4U Corsair's engine roared like an angry god as I pulled back on the stick, climbing through 8,000 feet above the blood-soaked beaches of Okinawa. Below me, the morning mist clung to palm groves that had turned into death traps for our Marines. Japanese artillery pieces, hidden like deadly serpents in those tropical shadows, had been raining hell on our boys for 3 days straight. Every few seconds, orange flashes erupted from the jungle canopy, followed by the distant thunder of shells exploding on American positions. I could see tiny figures, our Marines, pinned down behind whatever cover they could find, unable to advance another yard. That was about to change. I flew with VF-84, the Wolfpack Squadron aboard USS Bunker Hill. It was April 6, 1945, and we were about to show the Japanese what American air power could do when unleashed on their hidden gun positions. As I banked my Corsair to the left, the distinctive bent wings catching the morning light, I felt the familiar weight of 8.50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready in my wings. Beneath my fuselage, a single 500-pound bomb hung like a promise of destruction. Around me, 11 other Corsairs from my squadron held formation, their propellers cutting through the humid Pacific air with deadly precision. "Tally-ho, Wolfpack," came the voice of Major Robert "Hawk" Henderson through my headset. Our squadron leader was a 30-year-old veteran from Texas who had already shot down 14 Japanese aircraft in the previous months of fighting. His voice carried the calm authority that came from seeing too much combat and surviving it all. "Target area is bearing 090, 2 miles out. Intel reports at least 6 Type 96 howitzers and multiple machine gun nests in those palm groves. The jarheads have been getting murdered down there for 3 days." I adjusted my radio frequency and looked down at the tactical map strapped to my knee. The Japanese had been clever, too clever. When our invasion force had landed on Okinawa 12 days earlier, we expected the usual banzai charges and desperate counterattacks that had characterized previous island battles. Instead, General Mitsuru Ushijima had pulled his forces back into prepared defensive positions, letting us come ashore almost unopposed. Then, once we were committed to the beachhead, his artillery had opened up from carefully concealed positions throughout the island's interior. The 96th Infantry Division and elements of the 1st Marine Division had been trying to break through the Japanese outer defensive line for days, but every time they advanced, hidden gun positions would open fire with devastating effect. American casualties were mounting, and our ground forces were stuck in a deadly stalemate. That's where we came in. "Wolf leader to all aircraft." Major Henderson's voice crackled through the static. "We're going in low and fast. First pass will be strafing runs to suppress enemy fire. Second pass, we drop our eggs right on their heads. Keep your eyes open for muzzle flashes. That's how we find these bastards." The Corsair was built for this kind of work. With its massive Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp engine generating over 2,000 horsepower, the F4U could dive at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour while maintaining perfect control. The plane's distinctive inverted gull wings weren't just for show. They allowed for shorter landing gear while keeping the massive propeller clear of the ground. More importantly for our mission, those wings could carry substantial ordnance while the aircraft maintained exceptional maneuverability. As we approached the target area, I could see the problem our Marines faced. The palm groves stretched for nearly a mile inland from the beach, their thick canopy providing perfect concealment for Japanese positions. From ground level, it would be nearly impossible to spot the hidden artillery pieces. But from our vantage point at 6,000 feet, I could make out subtle irregularities in the tree line, areas where palms had been cut down to create firing lanes, or where camouflage nets had been stretched between trees to hide equipment. "There," I said into my radio, banking my Corsair to point toward a section of grove about 800 yards inland. "Grid reference Charlie 7. I can see camouflage netting between those trees, and there's a clear path cut through the palms. That's got to be a gun position." "Good eye, Lieutenant," came Henderson's reply. "Wolfpack, target is Charlie 7. Let's show them what happens when you mess with Marines." The Japanese had no idea what was coming. Their artillery positions had been carefully prepared for ground attack, with interconnected trenches, underground bunkers, and multiple escape routes. What they hadn't counted on was the devastating effectiveness of American close air support. The F4U Corsair, with its combination of speed, firepower, and accuracy, was about to turn their hidden fortress into a burning ruin. "Wolfpack, this is Wolf Leader. Tally ho, tally ho, tally ho. We're going in." I pushed the stick forward and felt my stomach rise as the Corsair's nose dropped toward the earth. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. The palm grove grew larger in my windscreen, and I could start to make out individual trees. At 2,000 feet, I rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, the massive engine screaming as I plummeted toward the Japanese positions. The sensation of diving a Corsair at full power is unlike anything else in the world. The aircraft shakes and vibrates as it approaches its maximum dive speed, but it remains perfectly controllable. Through my canopy, I could see the other Corsairs in my squadron spread out in line astern formation, each pilot following his leader into the attack. The sound of 12 Pratt and Whitney engines at maximum power must have been audible for miles. At 1,000 feet, I leveled out and began my strafing run. The palm grove filled my gun sight, and I could now see the camouflage netting clearly. Underneath it, I caught a glimpse of something metallic, the barrel of a Japanese howitzer. My thumb found the trigger button on my control stick. "Fox 1 going hot," I called out and pressed the trigger. The F4U shuddered as all 8 .50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was like thunder trapped in a metal box, and the aircraft shook from the recoil. Ahead of me, the palm grove erupted in a line of destruction as 8 streams of armor-piercing bullets tore through the camouflage netting and into the hidden artillery position below. The effectiveness was immediate and devastating. The heavy, 50 caliber rounds, each one capable of punching through armor plate, shredded the palm trees and ripped apart everything underneath. I could see dirt and vegetation flying through the air as my bullets found their mark. Then, suddenly, there was a bright orange flash, and a column of black smoke rose from the grove. I had hit an ammunition dump. "Direct hit," I called into my radio as I pulled up and banked to the right, climbing away from the target. Secondary explosion in the grove. I got their ammo. Behind me, Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez from San Antonio was beginning his run. Rodriguez was only 22 years old, but he flew like a man possessed. His Corsair dove toward the same section of grove, guns blazing. I could see the tracers from his machine guns cutting through the smoke from my previous attack. And then another explosion erupted from the Japanese position. "That's 2 for 2, Wolfpack," came Rodriguez's excited voice. "I can see Japs running through the trees down there. They're abandoning the position." One by one, the other Corsairs in our squadron made their attack runs. Each pilot dove on the hidden Japanese positions with deadly accuracy, their machine guns ripping apart camouflage nets and shredding artillery pieces. The palm grove, which had been a quiet, concealed fortress just minutes before, was now a blazing inferno of destroyed equipment and scattered Japanese soldiers. But we weren't finished yet. Each Corsair still carried a 500-pound bomb, and Major Henderson had identified additional targets throughout the grove. "Wolfpack, this is Wolf Leader. Excellent work on the first pass. Now we're going in with iron bombs. I want to make sure nothing in that grove survives to shoot at our Marines. Form up for bombing runs, spacing at 30-second intervals." The bombing runs required even more precision than the strafing attacks. A 500-pound general-purpose bomb could destroy an entire artillery position, but only if it was delivered accurately. The Corsair wasn't designed as a dive bomber like the SPD Dauntless, but it was certainly capable of accurate bomb delivery in the hands of a skilled pilot. I climbed back to 4,000 feet and began my bombing run. This time, I was targeting a section of grove about 200 yards east of my first attack, where I had spotted what looked like a prepared bunker position. The Japanese had gotten clever about concealing their strong points, building them to look like natural features of the landscape from the air. But from my previous strafing run, I had noticed that the vegetation pattern wasn't quite right in that area. The palms were too evenly spaced, and there were too many open areas between the trees. Rolling into my dive, I pushed the Corsair to its limits. The aircraft was heavier now with the bomb load, but it still handled beautifully. At 1,500 feet, I could see my target clearly, a rectangular structure covered with palm fronds and camouflage netting, probably a command bunker or ammunition storage facility. I held the dive until I reached 800 feet, then released my bomb and pulled hard on the stick. The Corsair climbed away as the 500-pound bomb fell toward the Japanese position. I counted to myself 1001, 1002, 1003, and then the bomb detonated. The explosion was massive. The entire section of grove disappeared in a cloud of dirt, smoke, and flying debris. When the smoke cleared a few seconds later, there was nothing left but a smoking crater where the Japanese position had been. Trees for 50 yards in every direction had been flattened by the blast. "Outstanding bomb run, Lieutenant," came Henderson's voice. "That's a direct hit." Moving to the next target. For the next 20 minutes, our squadron methodically destroyed every Japanese position we could find in that section of palm grove. Rodriguez put his bomb directly on top of what turned out to be a camouflaged Type 96 howitzer, the explosion throwing the 6-inch gun barrel nearly 50 feet through the air. Lieutenant Mike O'Brien from Boston scored a hit on a machine gun nest that had been carved into a small hill, the explosion collapsing the entire position and burying its occupants. By the time we had expended all our ammunition and bombs, the palm grove looked like the surface of the moon. Smoke rose from at least a dozen separate fires, and the neat rows of palm trees had been replaced by a landscape of craters, fallen timber, and scattered military equipment. More importantly, the Japanese artillery that had been terrorizing our Marines for 3 days had been completely silenced. "Wolfpack, this is Wolf Leader." Henderson's voice came through my headset and as we formed up for the return flight to Bunker Hill. "Mission accomplished. Let's head home and let the jarheads know they can advance." As we flew back toward our carrier, I could already see the results of our attack. On the beach below, Marines who had been pinned down behind sand dunes and makeshift barricades were now moving forward in extended formation. Without the constant threat of artillery fire, they could advance on the Japanese positions that had stopped their progress for days. The radio chatter from the ground controllers confirmed what I was seeing. "Air support, this is Groundhog 6, came the voice of a Marine Company commander. "Outstanding work up there. We're moving forward now with no enemy fire. Repeat, no enemy fire. You boys just saved a lot of Marine lives today. That was what we lived for, knowing that our missions made a difference in the lives of the men fighting on the ground." The Corsair pilots of VF-84 weren't fighting an abstract war in the sky. We were directly supporting American infantrymen and Marines who depended on us to clear the way for their advances. But even as we celebrated our success, I knew this was just one small victory in what was shaping up to be the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Okinawa was different from the other island battles we had fought. The Japanese had learned from their defeats at Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Instead of sacrificing their forces in futile banzai charges, they had adopted a strategy of defense in depth, forcing American forces to fight for every yard of ground. General Ushijima had positioned over 100,000 Japanese soldiers in prepared defensive positions throughout Okinawa's mountainous interior. They had spent months digging tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions, turning the entire island into a fortress. The Japanese plan was simple: inflict maximum casualties on American forces and hopefully force a negotiated peace that would preserve the Japanese home islands from invasion. What they hadn't counted on was the devastating effectiveness of American air support. The F4U Corsair had been designed from the beginning as a fighter aircraft, intended to shoot down Japanese planes in air-to-air combat. But by 1945, the Japanese had very few aircraft left to challenge American air superiority. Instead, the Corsair had evolved into one of the most effective ground attack aircraft in the world. The statistics spoke for themselves. Each F4U carried 8 .50 caliber machine guns with over 2,300 rounds of ammunition. In a single strafing pass, a Corsair could deliver more firepower than an entire infantry company. The aircraft could also carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs or rockets, making it capable of destroying virtually any target on the battlefield. More importantly, the Corsair could deliver this firepower with pinpoint accuracy. Unlike strategic bombers that dropped their ordnance from high altitude with limited precision, Corsair pilots could place their weapons within yards of friendly forces without endangering them. This made close air support possible in situations where artillery would be too dangerous to use. As we approached USS Bunker Hill, I could see the massive carrier steaming through the blue Pacific waters. The ship was a floating city, home to over 3,000 sailors and airmen who kept the aircraft operational around the clock. On her flight deck, other squadrons were preparing for their missions. SB-2C Helderver dive bombers loaded with 1,000-pound bombs, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers configured for ground attack missions, and more F4U Corsairs armed with rockets and machine guns. The sight never failed to impress me. American Industrial Might had produced not just this single carrier, but dozens like her, along with hundreds of other warships and thousands of aircraft. The Japanese, for all their fanatical determination, simply couldn't match the productive capacity of American factories. Every week, new aircraft rolled off assembly lines in Connecticut, California, and a dozen other states. Every month, new ships slid down the ways in shipyards from Maine to Washington. Landing a Corsair on a carrier deck required absolute precision and nerves of steel. The F4U was not an easy aircraft to land under the best circumstances. Its long nose blocked forward visibility, and the aircraft had a tendency to bounce on landing. Landing on a moving carrier deck in the middle of the ocean made the process even more challenging. I followed Henderson into the landing pattern, reducing power and lowering my landing gear and flaps. The carrier grew larger in my windscreen as I approached, and I could see the landing signal officer standing on his platform beside the flight deck, holding his colored paddles to guide me in. The key to a successful carrier landing was to maintain precise airspeed and glide path all the way to touchdown. Too fast, and you would miss the arresting wires and crash into the barriers at the far end of the deck. Too slow, and you would stall and crash into the stern of the ship. The margin for error was measured in feet and seconds. "Corsair 77, you're looking good," came the voice of the air boss over the radio. "Call the ball when you have it in sight." The ball was a visual landing aid that helped pilots maintain the correct glide path. When I could see it clearly, I called out 77, Corsair ball, 3.2 indicating my fuel state in thousands of pounds. My Corsair touched down on the carrier deck with a bone-jarring thud, and I felt the familiar jerk as the tailhook caught one of the arresting wires stretched across the deck. The aircraft decelerated from over 90 miles per hour to zero in less than 150 feet, the arresting gear bringing me to a stop just yards from where I had touched down. "Welcome back, Lieutenant," called out Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, the plane captain for my aircraft. Sullivan was a career Navy man from Philadelphia who had been maintaining aircraft for 15 years. He knew more about the Corsair than most pilots, and his expert care kept my plane flying mission after mission. "How'd she handle up there?" "Like a dream, Chief," I replied, climbing down from the cockpit. "Put some pretty big holes in the Japanese today. You should have seen those artillery positions blow up." Sullivan grinned and began his post-flight inspection of the aircraft. He would check every system, refuel the plane, and reload the machine guns for the next mission. In a few hours, another pilot might take this same Corsair on a different mission, or I might fly it again on an afternoon strike against Japanese positions elsewhere on Okinawa. The debriefing took place in the squadron ready room, where Major Henderson gathered all 12 pilots who had participated in the morning's mission. The walls were covered with maps of Okinawa, showing known Japanese positions, friendly force locations, and target areas for future missions. Intelligence officers took notes as each pilot described what he had seen and attacked during the mission. "Outstanding work this morning, gentlemen," Henderson began. "Intelligence reports that we destroyed at least 6 artillery pieces, multiple machine gun positions, and 1 major ammunition dump. More importantly, the Marines have been able to advance over 500 yards since our attack with minimal casualties." The intelligence briefing that followed painted a sobering picture of the battle for Okinawa. Japanese resistance was far stronger than anyone had anticipated. General Ushijima had organized his defenses around 3 major defensive lines stretching across the southern portion of the island. Each line consisted of interconnected bunkers, artillery positions, and underground tunnels that allowed Japanese forces to move unseen between positions. American casualties were already mounting. In just 2 weeks of fighting, the 96th Infantry Division had suffered over 1,500 killed and wounded. The 1st Marine Division had lost nearly 1,000 men. At this rate, capturing Okinawa would cost tens of thousands of American lives. But the Japanese losses were even higher. Our morning's mission was just one of hundreds of similar attacks being conducted every day by American aircraft. Navy and Marine Corsair squadrons were systematically destroying Japanese defensive positions throughout the island. Army Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs were conducting similar missions in other sectors. The cumulative effect was devastating to Japanese morale and combat effectiveness. Unlike previous battles where Japanese forces could retreat to prepared positions when under attack, the intensity of American air operations made it nearly impossible for enemy forces to move during daylight hours. Japanese soldiers were trapped in their bunkers and tunnels, unable to resupply or reinforce threatened positions. Intelligence estimates that we've destroyed over 200 Japanese artillery pieces in the past 2 weeks, the briefing officer continued. Enemy counter-battery fire has decreased by 70% compared to the first week of the operation. They're running out of guns, and more importantly, they're running out of ammunition. This was the true effectiveness of the Corsair in ground attack operations. While individual missions might seem small, destroying a single gun position or eliminating a machine gun nest, the cumulative effect of hundreds of such missions was the systematic destruction of Japanese combat capability. After the briefing, I walked out onto the carrier's flight deck to watch the afternoon launch. 24 Corsairs from 2 different squadrons were preparing for another strike against Japanese positions on the northern part of Okinawa. The flight deck was a choreographed dance of organized chaos, with plane handlers positioning aircraft on the catapults, ordnance men loading bombs and rockets, and fuel crews topping off gas tanks. The sound of aircraft engines warming up filled the air. The distinctive note of the Corsair's R2800 engine was unmistakable, a deep, powerful roar that spoke of raw horsepower and mechanical precision. When all 24 engines were running at once, the noise was overwhelming, but it was also somehow reassuring. It was the sound of American industrial might being brought to bear against the enemy. The launch itself was spectacular. One by one, the Corsairs rolled down the flight deck and lifted off into the afternoon sky. Each aircraft was loaded with bombs, rockets, or additional fuel tanks, depending on its specific mission. Within minutes, the entire strike force had formed up and was heading toward Okinawa, ready to continue the systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions. I thought about the Japanese soldiers waiting in their bunkers and tunnels, knowing that American aircraft would be overhead within the hour. They had no air cover. The Japanese had lost most of their remaining aircraft in desperate kamikaze attacks against our fleet. They had no effective anti-aircraft defenses. American radar-guided destroyers and cruisers had systematically destroyed Japanese air defense positions over the previous weeks. All they could do was huddle in their underground shelters and hope that American bombs wouldn't find them. For soldiers who had been trained to die gloriously for the Emperor, this passive defensive strategy must have been psychologically devastating. Instead of dying in heroic bonza charges, they were being systematically hunted down and killed by an enemy they couldn't even see. The afternoon brought news of continued success. The Corsair strike that had launched after lunch had destroyed another major Japanese ammunition dump, causing a series of secondary explosions that could be heard for miles. Ground forces reported that enemy artillery fire had virtually ceased in the northern sector of the island. But the Japanese weren't giving up without a fight. As evening approached, radar operators on the ships of Task Force 58 began picking up contacts approaching from the north. Japanese kamikaze aircraft were attempting another mass attack against the American fleet. General quarters sounded throughout Bunker Hill, and within minutes the ship was buzzing with activity. Damage control parties took their stations, gun crews manned their weapons, and those aircraft that could be launched immediately were sent aloft to intercept the incoming kamikaze. I was scheduled for the evening combat air patrol, along with 7 other Corsair pilots from VF-84. We launched just as the sun was setting, climbing rapidly to intercept the Japanese aircraft before they could reach our fleet. "Bogies bearing 340, Angels 8, came the voice of the fighter direction officer from the radar picket destroyer. "Multiple contacts, looks like at least 20 bandits inbound." The beauty of the F4U Corsair as a fighter aircraft was its combination of speed, climb rate, and firepower. The massive engine gave it excellent performance at all altitudes, while the 850 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower against enemy aircraft. Japanese planes in 1945 were increasingly obsolete, flown by inexperienced pilots who had received minimal training. We intercepted the kamikaze 20 miles from the fleet. They were flying in loose formation at about 8,000 feet, mostly old Valdai bombers and K-torpedo planes that had been converted for suicide attacks. The pilots were young and desperate, willing to die for the Emperor, but lacking the experience to be effective in combat. "Tally-ho, bandits at 2 o'clock high," I called over the radio as I spotted the Japanese formation. "Looks like 15 to 20 aircraft mixed types." The air battle that followed was brief and one-sided. The Japanese pilots were so focused on reaching the American fleet that they made no attempt to defend themselves against our attacks. They flew straight and level, making perfect targets for our machine guns. I rolled in behind a Valdai bomber, lined up my gun sight, and pressed the trigger. 8 streams of .50 caliber bullets converged on the Japanese aircraft, and it disintegrated in a ball of flame and debris. The pilot never knew what hit him. Around me, the other Corsairs were having similar success. Rodriguez shot down 2 kamikazes in as many minutes. O'Brien destroyed a K-torpedo bomber with a single burst of fire. Within 5 minutes, the entire Japanese formation had been wiped out. Not a single enemy aircraft reached the American fleet. "Splash all bandits," came Henderson's voice over the radio. "Good work, Wolfpack." That's 18 confirmed kills with no losses. This was the reality of air combat over Okinawa in 1945. American pilots, flying superior aircraft and backed by excellent radar direction, could intercept and destroy Japanese formations with minimal risk to themselves. The Japanese, desperate to stop the American invasion, were sending their remaining pilots on suicide missions that accomplished nothing except to provide target practice for our fighters. As we flew back to Bunker Hill in the gathering darkness, I reflected on the day's events. In a single day, our squadron had destroyed multiple Japanese artillery positions, silenced enemy guns that had been terrorizing American ground forces, and shot down 18 enemy aircraft. It had been a perfect example of American air power in action. But I also thought about the cost. Those Japanese pilots we had shot down were somebody's sons, brothers, husbands. They had died because their government had chosen to fight a war they couldn't win, sending young men to their deaths in increasingly desperate attempts to avoid inevitable defeat. Landing back on Bunker Hill was routine, despite the darkness. The carrier's flight deck was illuminated by powerful lights, and the landing signal officer guided each Corsair down to a safe landing. Chief Sullivan was waiting as I climbed out of the cockpit, ready to begin the post-flight inspection that would prepare the aircraft for the next day's missions. "How many did you get tonight, Lieutenant?" Sullivan asked as he began checking the machine guns for any signs of malfunction. "Just one," I replied. "But Rodriguez got 2 and O'Brien got 1 as well. We stopped them cold, didn't lose a single plane." Sullivan nodded approvingly. He had been maintaining Navy aircraft since before the war started, and he had seen the evolution of American air power from the early days when every mission was a desperate struggle to the current situation where American pilots could destroy enemy formations almost at will. The evening briefing confirmed what we had suspected. Japanese air power was virtually finished. Intelligence estimates suggested that the enemy had fewer than 300 operational aircraft remaining in all of Japan, and most of those were being held back to defend the home islands against the expected American invasion. "Gentlemen," Major Henderson addressed the assembled pilots, "today was a good day. We destroyed significant enemy ground positions, supported our Marine and Army brothers on the beach, and eliminated a major kamikaze threat against our fleet. But tomorrow we do it all over again." He was right, of course. The battle for Okinawa would continue for weeks, maybe months. Every day would bring new missions against Japanese positions, new kamikaze attacks to intercept, new opportunities to demonstrate American air superiority. But tonight, as I lay in my bunk listening to the sounds of the carrier moving through the Pacific swells, I allowed myself to feel some satisfaction in what we had accomplished. The palm grove that had been terrorizing American Marines that morning was now a smoking ruin. 18 Japanese aircraft that had been sent to attack our fleet were now scattered across the ocean floor. Most importantly, American ground forces were advancing again, pushing forward into the Japanese defensive lines with air support clearing the way. The F4U Corsair had proven itself to be more than just a fighter aircraft. It was a weapon system that could perform multiple roles with devastating effectiveness. In air-to-air combat, it could outfight any Japanese aircraft in the sky. In ground attack missions, it could destroy enemy positions with surgical precision. In fleet defense, it could intercept and eliminate kamikaze attacks before they reached their targets. But beyond the technical capabilities of the aircraft, the real story was about the men who flew them. American pilots like Rodriguez, O'Brien, Henderson, and thousands of others who had trained for years to master their craft. Navy and Marine ground crews like Chief Sullivan who kept the aircraft flying mission after mission. Intelligence officers who identified targets and planned missions. Radar operators who guided us to intercept enemy aircraft. The battle for Okinawa was being won by the combined efforts of hundreds of thousands of Americans, each doing their part to bring the war to a successful conclusion. The Corsair squadrons were just one part of this massive effort, but we were proud to be playing our role in the final defeat of Imperial Japan. Over the following weeks, VF-84 continued to fly daily missions against Japanese positions on Okinawa. We destroyed artillery positions, machine gun nests, bunkers, command posts, supply dumps, and communication facilities. We intercepted kamikaze attacks, conducted reconnaissance missions, and provided close air support for advancing ground forces. The cumulative effect was devastating to Japanese morale and combat effectiveness. By early May, organized Japanese resistance in the southern part of Okinawa had largely collapsed. American forces were advancing rapidly, capturing airfields and port facilities that would be crucial for the planned invasion of Japan itself. General Ushijima's strategy of defense in depth had failed completely. Instead of inflicting unacceptable casualties on American forces, his defensive positions had been systematically destroyed by American air power. The Japanese had lost over 90% of their artillery, most of their heavy weapons, and thousands of irreplaceable veteran soldiers. More importantly for the broader strategic picture, the battle for Okinawa had demonstrated the complete dominance of American air power over Japanese forces. The lesson was clear. Japanese defensive positions, no matter how well prepared or heavily fortified, could not survive sustained attack by American aircraft. This reality was not lost on Japanese leaders in Tokyo. The systematic destruction of their forces on Okinawa, combined with the increasing intensity of American bombing attacks against the home islands, was forcing them to confront the inevitable reality of defeat. On June 18, 1945, General Ushijima committed suicide rather than surrender, marking the effective end of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. The island had been completely secured at a cost of over 12,000 American killed and 36,000 wounded. But Japanese losses had been catastrophic. Over 100,000 soldiers killed, plus thousands of aircraft, hundreds of artillery pieces, and massive quantities of military equipment destroyed. For VF-84, the end of the Okinawa campaign meant new missions and new challenges. We were scheduled to participate in the planned invasion of Japan itself, codenamed Operation Downfall. Our Corsairs would provide air cover for the landing forces and conduct ground attack missions against Japanese defensive positions on the home islands. But as it turned out, those missions would never be necessary. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, and World War II was finally over. Looking back on my experiences flying the F4U Corsair over Okinawa, I'm struck by how completely the nature of warfare had changed. At the beginning of the war, air power had been seen as a supporting arm to ground and naval forces. By 1945, it had become the dominant factor in military operations. The Corsair had evolved from a pure fighter aircraft into a multi-role weapon system that could perform virtually any mission required. Its combination of speed, firepower, and accuracy made it the perfect tool for the kind of precision strikes that characterized American military operations in the final year of the war. But more than that, the Corsair represented American industrial and technological superiority over our enemies. The Japanese had started the war with excellent aircraft and highly trained pilots. By 1945, they were reduced to sending inexperienced teenagers on suicide missions in obsolete planes. American factories had produced over 12,500 F4U Corsairs during the war, along with tens of thousands of other military aircraft. Our training programs had produced thousands of skilled pilots, maintenance personnel, and support staff. Our technological advantage had given us radar, improved engines, better weapons, and more effective tactics. The victory over Japan wasn't just a military triumph, it was proof of the superiority of American democratic and industrial systems over totalitarian regimes that relied on fanaticism and brutality rather than innovation and efficiency. As I write this account many years after the war, I'm reminded of the incredible courage and dedication of the men I served with. Flying combat missions over enemy territory, knowing that a single mistake or mechanical failure could mean death or capture, required a special kind of bravery. Landing on a carrier deck at night, in rough weather, with battle damage to your aircraft, tested every pilot's skill and nerve. But we did our jobs because we knew what we were fighting for. We were fighting to preserve American freedom and democracy against enemies who wanted to destroy everything our country represented. We were fighting to protect our families, our communities, and our way of life. The F4U Corsair gave us the tools we needed to win that fight. It was fast enough to catch enemy aircraft, maneuverable enough to outfight them, and powerful enough to destroy enemy positions on the ground. Most importantly, it was reliable enough to bring us home after every mission. The palm groves of Okinawa are peaceful now, with new trees growing where Japanese artillery positions once terrorized American Marines. The airfields where Corsairs once launched on combat missions are now civilian airports serving commercial flights. The carriers that once steamed through the Pacific launching airstrikes against enemy positions have been scrapped or turned into museums. But the memory of what we accomplished remains. In April 1945, American air power reached the peak of its effectiveness in World War II. Corsair squadrons like VF-84 could destroy enemy positions with surgical precision, intercept kamikaze attacks with devastating effectiveness, and provide close air support that saved countless American lives. The battle for Okinawa proved that American technology, training, and industrial capacity could overcome any enemy, no matter how fanatical or determined. The F4U Corsair was the weapon that turned that potential into reality, delivering American firepower exactly where it was needed most. That morning in April, when we dove on those hidden Japanese artillery positions, we weren't just conducting another mission. We were demonstrating the final evolution of American air power in World War II, precise, devastating, and unstoppable. The palm groves that had sheltered Japanese guns for days were destroyed in minutes by American pilots flying American aircraft built in American factories. It was a perfect symbol of how the war would end. American technology and determination overcoming Japanese fanaticism and desperation. The rising sun that had once seemed so threatening was finally setting on the Japanese Empire, and American wings were carrying the dawn of victory across the Pacific sky. The sound of 12 Corsair engines roaring over Okinawa that morning was more than just the noise of aircraft. It was the sound of American freedom defending itself, American industry supporting its military, and American courage facing down tyranny wherever it chose to make its stand. We flew home that day with victory painted across our wingtips, knowing that we had done our part to bring the war closer to its inevitable end. The Japanese artillery that had killed American Marines was silenced forever, reduced to twisted metal scattered among the burning palm trees. The Corsair had proven itself that day as more than just an aircraft. It was an instrument of American resolve, a symbol of what free men could accomplish when their cause was just and their determination absolute. Every mission we flew, every enemy position we destroyed, every kamikaze we shot down brought us one step closer to the moment when American forces would stand victorious on Japanese soil. But victory came at a price that we understood even then. War is not a game or an adventure. It's a deadly serious business where young men die far from home, where split-second decisions determine who lives and who doesn't, where the difference between success and failure is measured in lives saved or lost. I think about my squadron mates who didn't make it home. Rodriguez was shot down over Kyushu in July, his Corsair hit by anti-aircraft fire while attacking a Japanese radar station. O'Brien crash-landed on the carrier deck after a night mission, his aircraft badly damaged, but his crew chief Sullivan somehow got him flying again the next day. Henderson survived the war but died in a training accident 2 years later, testing a new jet fighter that wasn't ready for the demands he placed on it. These men, and thousands like them, gave everything they had to ensure that American freedom would survive the greatest challenge it had ever faced. They flew their Corsairs into harm's way day after day, not because they loved war or killing, but because they understood that some things are worth fighting for. The F4U Corsair was the perfect weapon for that fight. It combined American industrial might with American technological innovation and American fighting spirit. In the hands of properly trained pilots, backed by excellent maintenance and supported by superior intelligence, it became an unstoppable force for victory. When I think back to that morning over Okinawa, watching those palm groves erupt in flames as our 8 machine guns tore apart Japanese positions, I remember the satisfaction of knowing we had probably saved dozens of American lives. Those Marines who had been pinned down for 3 days could finally advance, could finally accomplish their mission because 12 Corsair pilots had done their job with precision and deadly effectiveness. That's what American air power meant in 1945, the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower exactly where it was needed, when it was needed, with surgical precision that protected friendly forces while destroying the enemy. It was the ultimate expression of American military superiority, and it won the war. The thunder of Corsair engines over the Pacific wasn't just the sound of aircraft. It was the sound of freedom defending itself, democracy proving its superiority over tyranny, and American resolve carrying the day against impossible odds. When we flew home that April morning with our guns empty and our mission complete, we carried with us the certainty that we had done our part to secure victory for the United States of America. The war would end 4 months later, but the job we did that day over Okinawa, and on hundreds of similar days throughout the Pacific campaign, had already decided the outcome. American air power, embodied in aircraft like the F4U Corsair and flown by pilots trained in American flight schools, had proven superior to anything the enemy could put in the sky or hide on the ground. That was our victory, earned through courage, skill, and determination. That was our contribution to the greatest military triumph in American history. And that was why we flew, not for glory or recognition, but for the simple, powerful knowledge that we were defending everything that made America worth defending.